So my first explanation, I think, is incorrect. That Matthew 4:12 has a causal relationship with 4:13. That Yeshua was fleeing from arrest, right? I mean, it does sound like that, doesn't it? Right? Well, it didn't sound that way to you, Keith?
It absolutely did. Actually, I thought of it this way, Nehemia, and I'm looking forward to hearing what you think is the second way. I kind of put it into modern times. I thought what if Herod, runs it like the mafia, and if he's anything like his father, he hates threats. So he finds out about John. We're going to get to that later, about what John did that got him in prison. He knows about Yeshua, who's his cousin. Yeshua knows that he knows about him. And obviously, because it just later says, is this John raised from the dead? And that Yeshua thinks, if I go back to Nazareth, that's where the family is. They're probably going to be looking there first. I don't want to spend my time in Nazareth. So I'm going to move on to be with more of the other people and kind of mix in with the crowd. I didn't know. But I thought about maybe it was the kind of situation where it wasn't that he was fleeing as much as, look, I'm not going to go back to the hometown. I'm going to move on to Capernaum, which we're going to talk about what that might signify.
Well, so that's really important that you said that, right? Because the way it sounds when I read it, at least, is he's like, well, okay, I'm leaving Nazareth, going to Capernaum, and that is withdrawing to Galilee. But that's not right. In other words, he has three different locations here. Location A, which isn't identified, but from the context we can say it's somewhere around the Jordan or the Judean desert. Location B, which is Nazareth, and then location C, which is Capernaum, which I can't wait to talk about Capernaum because that's the exciting place. So the second explanation, which I think is the correct one, is John is arrested, so there's nothing for Yeshua no reason for him to stick around Jericho anymore, or Perea in that area. There's no reason for him to stay where he is in the area of the Judean desert. He had been there while John had his ministry, and now that he hears John's been arrested, okay, I'm going back home. And so he leaves the area around the Jordan, and he goes up to Nazareth, right? So there's three locations here, and that's what's not so clear when you read it in English. It's clearer in Hebrew. Here's the cool thing in Hebrew, right? So it says, and it came to pass in those days, and Yeshua heard that John was turned over into imprisonment, and he went to Gilgal. Where's Gilgal? Gilgal is a little village not far from where he had been ministering, right? So John is just across the Jordan River, baptizing people and doing his ministry. And so Yeshua crosses the Jordan River, goes to Gilgal, which is a couple miles from there. And then from there, he passes Nazareth. And then in a third stage, he dwells in Kfar Nahum and this is very, very, a lot of things going on here. Let's talk about Nazareth.
Wait, before you do that, Nehemia, I think this is an opportunity. Can we just do, because this, to me, what you just said is why Hebrew Matthew is so amazing, and I think Gilgal is a pearl. Can you just open up the tap to let people know the significance of the Gilgal potentially that he may have gone to? In other words, it says we're dealing with geography here and what happened there. If it's after the test, it kind of would make sense. I mean, it could be something worth looking at.
Let me jump back. Gilgal is a village not far from Jericho.
Right.
It's mentioned in the Tanakh. We'll talk about it in a second. The Galilee is a whole region in northern Israel, mountainous region north of the Jezreel Valley and the Bet Shan Valley. So it's two. So one's a village and one's a city. The difference in Hebrew between Gilgal and Galilee is Galil, Gimel Lamed Yud Lamed, and Gilgal is Gimel Lamed Gimel Lamed. So the difference between Galilee and Gilgal is whether there's a Yud or a Gimel, right? So it's maybe two strokes of the pen, really one longer stroke and a second stroke, right? It's almost identical graphically. And there's no question whatsoever that either Gilgal is a corruption of Galil, Galilee, or Galil, Galilee is a corruption of Gilgal, right? One of the two is definitely the case. We actually have one manuscript of Hebrew Matthew where somebody said, oh no, this is supposed to be Galilee. How do I know it's supposed to be Galilee? Because it's Galilee in the Greek. And they changed Gilgal to Galil.
Wait a minute.
Right?
You found that?
Oh yeah. Well, Howard even brings it in his notes, right? There's no question, right? This is a known thing. So Gilgal and Galil, one is a scribal error or maybe an intentional scribal change for the other. In other words, what could have happened? let's say for argument's sake, Gilgal is the original reading. And so the scribe is copying it, and he says, Gilgal? We know he went to Galilee, so he changes it, and Galilee appears all over the New Testament. Gilgal is, hardly, I don't know if it's ever mentioned in the New Testament. It's definitely not an important place. It's in the Tanakh, even in a few places, pretty rare in the Tanakh. So Galil, so this is what we call, this is a scribal error of what happens is a rare term gets replaced with a common term.
There it is.
It's very common as a scribal error. For example, there's a stream in Israel called Yarmut. Never heard of Yarmut, but Yarmouk is a very common term in the Middle East. It's a very important place. And so the inhabitants there eventually started calling Yarmut Yarmouk after the more common, the better known place. Right? It's a very common thing that happens. The rabbis actually do this explicitly. They'll take some figure who's unknown, and they'll for example, it'll say the servant of Abraham. They'll say, who's the servant of Abraham? Well, it doesn't say, we don't know. They'll say, oh, that's Eliezer of Damascus. Right? Why? Because he's mentioned in a different chapter. And so you have an unknown place being replaced with a better known place. And here it's a little known place with a better known place. So that's the explanation of how we got from Gilgal to Galil. The other explanation, if it went the other direction, and I can't say for sure, right? Maybe the Greek has the original, right? In each case, really, we can't say for sure. We're presenting possibilities. If we say the Greek is original and it originally said Galil, and the Hebrew then is somebody copying Galil and replacing it with Gilgal, which is odd because he then quotes a verse about Galil, about Galilee, right? So it would be more understandable how Galilee would end up in that verse, because the verse in Isaiah a couple of verses later mentions Galil, whereas Gilgal, what does that have to do with it? But geographically, Gilgal makes a lot more sense to me. In other words, back to what we're saying, he's somewhere in Transjordan in the area of Perea. He then crosses over the Jordan a couple miles to Gilgal, and then from Gilgal he passes over to Nazareth.
Now,
and then from Nazareth he eventually dwells in Kfar Nahum. And yeah, go ahead. Keith.
So here's what I want you just to do. One thing, just in case people don't know. Can you go to the tap just for 1 second, folks? If you don't know about the tap, Nehemia is a wizard at this. Can you just let us know what happened in Gilgal for Israel? In other words, there was a conversation earlier in talking about Yeshua's life, paralleling what was happening in the desert, etc. So
okay, now you're going to get spiritual on me, Keith. Can we get spiritual here of what the spiritual significance
I'm only suggesting first you give us the information. Give us the information, and then let's see if we can get spiritual.
Okay. All right, so this is beautiful. Joshua 5:9 is really the part we want here. This is where Gilgal gets its name, right? So he refers to Gilgal in Joshua 4, but it actually hasn't been called Gilgal yet, right? He might be writing this years later. And Yehovah said to Joshua, today I have rolled away from you the disgrace of Egypt.
Yes, sir.
Galoti et chilpat Mitzrayim. I've rolled away. Galoti is I've rolled away.
Yes.
So that place was called Gilgal, as it still is. So how did he roll away and there's actually a play on words here, okay? How did he roll away the disgrace of Egypt? In verse 2, it says of Joshua 5, at that time Yehovah said to Yoshua, make flint knives and proceed with the second circumcision of the Israelites, meaning they hadn't been circumcised for years. So Yoshua had flint knives made, and the Israelites were circumcised at Givat Ha'aralot, that is which means the hill of the foreskins. This is the reason why Joshua had the circumcision performed. All the people who had come out of Egypt, all the males of military age, had died during the desert wandering after leaving Egypt. Now, whereas all the people who came out of Egypt had been circumcised, none of the people born after the Exodus during the desert wanderings had been circumcised. For the Israelites had traveled in the wilderness 40 years until the entire nation, the men of military age who had left Egypt, had perished because they had not obeyed Yehovah, and Yehovah had sworn never to let them see the land that Yehovah had sworn to their fathers to assign us a land flowing with milk and honey. But he raised up their sons in their stead, and it was these that Yoshua circumcised, for they were uncircumcised, not even circumcised on the way. After circumcising of the whole nation was completed, they remained where they were in the camp until they recovered. So there's actually a little bit of a play on words here, right? Then Yehovah says, I have rolled away the disgrace of Egypt. What's the disgrace of Egypt? So throughout the wandering of the desert for 40 years, everybody who was born in the desert was uncircumcised.
Amen.
And this was the place where they were circumcised, and Gilgal represents the rolling away of the disgrace, passing from an uncircumcised state into a circumcised state. There's also a play on words here, perhaps, because they may have thrown, it sounds like they threw all the foreskins into a big pile, and it made a mound. And then Gilgal also can be from the word gal, which means mound. So there's two different words where to roll away the disgrace and also the mound of the foreskins. So that's interesting. In other words, you're saying, I don't know if you're saying.
Well, let me tell you what I'm saying. So you and I have had experiences over the years where we'll go to a place that has a significance, Tanakh significance. And there have even been times, Nehemia, where there have been places that weren't even Tanakh significant, but had a spiritual significance in my mind that you've even agreed to go with me to. For example, when you agreed to go with me into Egypt to go to Mount Sinai, there was a spiritual significance to what had happened at that place. Is it possible that Yeshua also is thinking about, this is the process that's going on. He's just come from his temptation, which he had also been before that, his baptism at the Jordan. And would he want to stop first at the place that Israel stopped first after they crossed the Jordan? Maybe Gilgal, maybe he's thinking about what took place both physically and spiritually, a rolling away, a circumcision maybe of the heart. Who knows what happens? But could it be possible that he was thinking about geography also? Before we go to the Galilee to start my ministry, John's ministry's dispensation is now over. He's in prison. I'm not going to take over John's baptism ministry. I'm going to go to Gilgal for a while, spend some time there before we get to the exciting part about what's going to happen next. I'm just throwing it out.
So I think what we could definitely say here is that he is retracing the steps of the Israelites as they're entering the land. He's gone into the Jordan River, come up out of the Jordan River. He has to cross the Jordan to get to Gilgal or Galilee.
Amen.
He crosses the Jordan River, and then he goes to the first place that the Israelites go when they enter the land, which is Gilgal. So he's gone from baptism to circumcision. That would be the spiritual interpretation.
Before he crosses over, he goes to Masah. He goes through the test. He goes through the test on the other side. He then crosses over. This is like perfect. But here's the exciting part. Here's the pearl, folks. Here's the pearl. Hebrew Matthew says Gilgal. If I'm reading in English, I can't pull that out under any circumstance. I mean, to me, that's wow.
Does Howard have Gilgal, or does he write Galilee there?
Of course he has Gilgal.
Oh, he does. Okay.
Yeah, he has Gilgal in his. But I'm just saying, we're looking at the English. I would never to know anything about Gilgal or anything about the circumcision.
Yeah.
I mean, wow.
So, all right. So I had offered the text critical explanation that one is a scribal error for another, but you're saying there actually could be here some spiritual significance of why Matthew wrote Gilgal, or maybe some scribe in the Middle Ages. Here, you would be hard to say this was a rabbi, right? You'd have to say this was some Jewish believer in Yeshua who's saying, when Yeshua entered the land, surely the first place he went is the first place the Israelites entered the land, which is Gilgal. Or maybe that's what Matthew wrote originally. There's definitely a spiritual application here that he's now essentially followed the footsteps of the Israelites. They had the test in the desert, which the Israelites failed, but Yeshua's passed. He then crosses over the Jordan just like they do, and he goes to Gilgal. Then he goes to Nazareth, except in Hebrew Matthew, in every manuscript I've been able to find, and I didn't look at all the manuscripts here because it would have taken forever, but I looked at many manuscripts, and all the ones I looked at least have, instead of Nazareth, have Nazarel. And it's hard to argue that that's anything but something very intentional, which is Nazareth would be Natseret, and Nazarel would be the Nazareth of God. So that's interesting. So he passed by the Nazarel of God. I don't know if you want to say something about that, Keith.
Yeah. Here's what I say. There's much in Scripture that says whether you turn to the left or to the right, you'll hear the voice behind you saying, this is the way, walk in it. There's the idea of your footsteps being ordered. I believe that from the time that Yeshua met his cousin at the Jordan until the time we're going to get to him finally speaking about what his ministry is. Every place he went had significance.